Good afternoon, good morning, and good day to everyone. I know we are scattered all over the world, and welcome to this seminar webinar on diversity in clinical trials. My name is Nhlanhla Msomi, and I'm president of BioAfrica and AfricaBio, the organization that hosts BioAfrica. And today I would like to welcome everyone to the first of a series of webinars that seek to explore and to start the dialogue around diversity in clinical trials. This from a number of angles. One of the angles, obviously the important one, is to speak to the issues of diversity where they regard equity, access to medicines that are relevant to different populations from across the world. But since BioAfrica is a Pan-African organization or a Pan-African platform today, we want to focus on this issue within the context of Africa or the African genome. Today, I have a very, very distinguished panel of speakers who are going to explore the issues, and I don't want to steal their thunder, even though I'm very tempted to try, but I doubt that I'll be able to surpass them. And they'll be sharing with us their perspectives and their insights as far as this issue is concerned. But before we move on to the speakers themselves, I want to pay homage or tribute to our sponsor for today's session, which is Amgen, who have joined hands with BioAfrica to launch this series of webinars. This partnership dates back to the last BioAfrica convention. As some of you may know, BioAfrica has been going on for the past 4 years. In actual fact, this marks the beginning of the launch program for the 5th version of the BioAfrica Convention, which brings together innovators from the rest of the continent, scientists, companies. It also brings into one space partnerships between the global north and the global south. And one could argue that today's seminar is really about exploring the issues about the distribution, about equity, as far as the distribution of power between the global north and the global south, how those who have resources are able to direct and dictate what sort of work gets done, whether it's in innovation, product development, or even in science. And I'm hoping that panelists will explore that further. I also am very, very pleased to know that some of the panelists will be looking at the partnerships that could work, such as public-private partnerships, because I think with the advent of COVID, a lot of us who are involved in this space have come to realize, perhaps a bit late, that the old partnerships in the way they were structured may not be adequate for moving the needle and for moving us towards equity. And lastly, as a way of introducing the subject, I am reminded of the fact that innovation sometimes can surprise you. 20, 30 years ago, the continent of Africa had very little infrastructure as far as telecommunications is concerned. So we did not have fixed telecommunications infrastructure, and we did not have digital infrastructure. However, the innovation that came with mobile telephony was such that we leapfrogged and we were able to see some surprising instances of fintech being launched in this very continent, surprising innovations such as M-Pesa from Kenya, mobile money, where in certain instances the continent has led in the development of game-changing innovations. And I'm hoping that with this diversity discussion, we can start dreaming at least, or visualizing a future where precision medicine can become a reality in this continent, because we do not have to go through the legacy issues that everyone else has to go through, and we could leapfrog the rest of the world or the rest of the community. And so this is the hope that this series of webinars or seminars will start to bring us to a point where we can craft a future that is possible, because we've seen it happening in other innovation spheres, but the individuals that are here will be able to help us. So as I said to you, I have a formidable lineup of panelists, starting with our first speaker, Professor Veronica Miller, who is well known in this area of focusing on patient advocacy and focusing on clinical trials that provide a wider access to medicines across the world. I'd like to invite Professor Miller, who is an adjunct professor of the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley, to give us her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's a real honor to be back with BioAfrica to talk about how can we increase diversity in clinical trials. I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the issues, and when we hear from Ms. Kemi Williams and Professor Moses, we will hear much more detail about some of the specific issues. Okay. And I really want to emphasize that this really is a global problem. It is not just a problem of not including patients in Africa themselves, but it really is a global issue. And certainly in the United States, we have our share here of deficiencies in really having diversity, the needed diversity in clinical trials. This was a paper that came out at the end of last year in the New England Journal of Medicine. The first author is Jenna Woodcock, who at that time was the acting commissioner of the US FDA. She's still there. She has a long history in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and really has driven a lot of innovative approaches at the FDA. And looking particularly at the health inequities that were revealed through the COVID-19 pandemic, they looked at the actual diversity in clinical trials that were submitted with new drug applications to the US FDA, and found that they had come up, the research enterprise in the US had really come up extremely short. And this paper is all about integrating research into community practice and hoping that that might be one way to increase diversity. And one of their key points was that community clinicians established trusting patient relationships, allow for transparency and open dialogue, as well as sharing knowledge about the benefits and risks of trial participation. And I think this is so key that this trust be there and be maintained. And the trust just doesn't happen on its own. It needs to be nurtured. And I think some of the legacies that we have in African research is and also here in the US and other parts of the world is really this lack of trust for sometimes very good reasons of colonialism and persistent racism. So in this paper, they review the new drugs that were submitted to the FDA for new molecular entities and biologics. And overall, these included only 8% of Black or African American people, 6% Asian, and 11% Hispanic or Latin. And this obviously is not the makeup of the US population. And they say in this article, the time has come for stakeholders in the clinical research ecosystem, the biomedical industry, policymakers, government agencies, contract research organizations, and patient advocates to support the development and long-term sustainability of an infrastructure that unites clinical research with clinical care. And this, I think, was written for the US, but I think it applies so much to all the situations. And maybe we can take your leapfrogging example, and maybe we can get to that point where we have really community embedded research much sooner in Africa than it's taken in Europe and in the US. When the COVID pandemic broke out, there was a French television program where two French physicians had made some comments about, oh, we can do these COVID trials in Africa because they don't have anything anyway, so we may as well just do them there, kind of implying that Africans would be happy even if they were not treated ethically the way they should be treated and integrated into clinical research. So with a group of people, some on our staff and also advocates from Africa and researchers from Africa, and we also have Stephanie Buchholz with their German agency and Regina Leonard as well. So it's a real mix of people. We put together this commentary called Addressing Colonialism and Persistent Racism. And one of the points we made was that Africa has been so key in so many trials, especially in infectious diseases, especially in HIV and also tuberculosis. And as much as we applaud this, one of the things we point out, though, is that a lot of this research is funded many times by the US federal government. And that means that the actual ownership of that research remains in the US. And I think that is something, if we talk about equitable partnerships, we really need to think about how we can really change that. And so there's a whole series of studies in HIV, but really a lot of these studies led to approval of drugs, and Africa was a key part of it. But why does it take so much longer for drugs to get registered in African countries? And Professor Moses, we really look forward to your conversation on this. So there are many benefits to participating in research. It's not just that we want we want the diversity at all levels in the clinical research, but it brings so many benefits that really access to clinical research is an essential component of providing equitable health. And I put that into quotation marks because this comes from the Janet Woodcock paper. And it allows for the continuous development of infrastructure and capacity. It's so important that patients and their clinicians, their nurses and their doctors really understand what these new medicines are about, what are the benefits and risks, and how does somebody make that decision? Yes, I will be, first of all, willing to be part of this research, but also willing to take the drug afterwards if it provides to my healthcare. But we need this autonomy in decision-making. And how can that happen if there's no experience with the research program in so many communities that get left out? And there's, of course, also a huge benefit of having more diversity to the research enterprise itself. So including pharmaceutical companies and biotechs and that whole enterprise of drug development. And if we have research embedded in the communities, it's so much easier to then go from a seamless transition from a clinical research part of the program to the implementation because it's already there. It doesn't have to be brought in as a completely novel entity. But that really does require a lot of community input. And as I put this in capitals, building a foundation of trust, that is just so important. And we can't really do that unless we really integrate the research into the communities and have the communities be full participants in the research enterprise. And Janet Woodcock, they were proposing a model for the US, but I think this, again, really applies to Africa specifically, but in the other community as well in the world. And then in terms of the contribution to global health, then we need an investment in building more infrastructure. But there's this return on investment that is so huge. And this is a cycle that really kind of keeps going. And it will benefit all because, as we know, when it comes to infectious diseases, the bugs don't stop at the border. They will become global very quickly. But also, not just for that reason, but for the health and well-being of everyone living in that continent, on that continent. And we really need to drive for equitable partnerships. And I really wanted to just give a very brief overview. And I thank you very much. And I will now pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Just for housekeeping, just to remind everybody that you could ask your questions in the chat box. We will only take questions at the end of the 3 presentations. Our next panelist or our next presenter is Ms. Kemi Williams. When I opened today's session, I mentioned the possibilities of leapfrogging legacy investments through precision medicine, specifically the intersection between science, data, and technology. And Kemi is one of the African innovators, biotech innovators that represent that future, at least in my own biased view. She's had an interesting and an exciting career where she has set up from the ground up clinical development practice within a biotech firm. And I'm pretty sure a lot of the audience today have heard of 54 Gene, which you've seen in the news. Very exciting, giving us hope. And I know that I'm putting you under pressure, Kemi, but I'd like to invite you to put yourself under even more pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Msomi. Let me see if I can. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you once again for this opportunity. I am really appreciative of Amgen, BioAfrica, and as well as all the panelists for setting up this webinar. We are having very, very important discussions around how to increase diversity in clinical trials. Today, I will be speaking about the opportunities and that are available to us in the future of precision medicine clinical trials in Africa. So the question that may come is, if we're talking about increasing diversity in clinical trials, then what role does precision medicine play? Well, we know that as precision medicine gains momentum globally, that it is becoming more and more important that we start to include people of African descent in this precision medicine research agenda to reduce existing healthcare disparities between the developed and developing countries, as well as to advance healthcare efficiency globally, and as well as to advance healthcare equity. So I'm so glad, I'm thankful for Professor Miller's last presentation, because really it becomes a case of equity. So what do we even mean by precision medicine? Precision medicine is also known to many people as personalized medicine. It's when we use the characterization of an individual's phenotypes and genotypes and use that to tailor the right therapeutic strategy for that person at the right time. And we can also use this information to determine their predisposition to diseases and to determine how we deliver timely and targeted treatment or preventative measures. But you really cannot have precision medicine product if you do not have precision medicine clinical trials that would validate that those products are actually safe and effective for that targeted population. So I give us a brief definition here. It's a trial type that's designed to select the study participants that are most likely to benefit from a particular medical product, taking into consideration the individual's genetic profile, environment, and lifestyle. And this is really what we mean by targeted, personalized healthcare. And here, in increasing clinical trial diversity, it provides an opportunity to find the right product for the right people at the right time. If we do not include Africans in that conversation, if we do not increase diversity in clinical trials, then only a few people would benefit from this innovative approach to clinical care, because it would only be those people that were included in the research associated with the medical product that would have the targeted product for the right people at the right time. When we're talking about precision medicine clinical trials or precision medicine in general, you're always thinking about two elements. We're talking about the discovery and development of drugs, right, based on DNA and phenotypic research into specific human populations. But you also have to be thinking about the companion diagnostic, the test that is used to identify before or during treatment patients that would most likely benefit. And of course, to ensure that patients that are likely to have increased risk of serious adverse events are not getting the drugs for that particular product. So why do we even have what we call precision medicine clinical trials? It's because the traditional trial designs, as we've always known, are inadequate. They are insufficient for addressing the dynamic complexity of the type of diseases and the genetic variation that we're looking for when we're running clinical trials. So you know, today's phase 3 clinical trials tend to be very large, and they even involve thousands of people with one specific disease. But as you know, for most of the approvals that we've gotten lately, the response rates are usually very low, even for those drugs that are already approved. With a precision medicine clinical trial, researchers can study the treatments that target just one aspect of a disease, for instance, a genetic mutation or a lifestyle trait, and then enroll only those people with that particular mutation. And by doing so, you're studying the people that are most likely to respond, and you're increasing treatment outcome. This is important as well in terms of how we're including Africans in this particular conversation is important in ensuring that we're addressing their own unique genetic or lifestyle variation. There are other advantages, as I have on the right-hand side. Precision medicine clinical trials are often smaller. They get better results for the reason I told you earlier, because they have the potential to reduce the background noise from including people that will not necessarily benefit from the particular product being investigated. They're very good at speeding up drug development. And in fact, they provide hope to patients who usually are wondering when the next drug will be out and why. How do they do that? By increasing clinical trial efficiencies between the public and private sectors, targeting the whole life cycle drug discovery, from the regulations that you're going to use to advance this, to how you're training the site, to how you're funding the institutions that are doing this research. We think that it is really key that we start to look at how the public sectors and the private sectors are coming into play on this. And then the last point I would mention is, as a strong consideration, is access to real-world data. To have, to be able to do genomic research effectively, you need the phenotypic information. Where is that? They're usually in the patient's medical records. Most African hospitals, or many, do not have what you call electronic health records. Many of them may not have the imaging data being stored in a way that allows someone to be able to link the phenotypic data to their images, to their genomic sequenced data. So looking at ways that we can build this infrastructure would enable us to be able to develop more hypotheses and answer better clinical questions around precision medicine for the continent. And I believe this would help drive as well and advance diversity in clinical trial on the continent. Thank you so much, everyone, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kemi, for an insightful presentation. I'm pretty sure that there's quite a few in the audience that want to interact and engage with you on some of the issues you've raised. The last panelist that I'm going to request to join us is our good friend, Professor Moses Bockarie, who is the Regional Director for Africa of the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership. Moses Bockarie also shares an interesting history with one of our strongest supporters, Tony Ndifo. Both of them having gone to the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. And I think we all agree that the first presentation spoke to issues of equity. The second one by Kemi was more around the issues of innovation, looking into the future. And I'm hoping that Moses will take us through it, being the leader of the biggest clinical trials funder in Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa, will take us through the issues of scale. What does it take in terms of resources and scale to move the needle somewhat? Moses, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Msomi. So I will share my slides now. Right, good. So I am focusing my discussions in diversity in clinical trials around the lessons that we learned from the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Why am I doing this? Because that was really like ground zero. That is the time when we had very little involvement of the national governments and national institutions in the clinical trials that took place there between 2014 and 2016. But we have to remind ourselves that only about 2% of clinical trials globally are really taking place in Africa. And if you can see here, looking at the number of trials per year and the WHO region, the African region is there with the blue line and it's clearly isolated here. So it's almost flat. So there's very little involvement of African institutions in clinical trials in globally. But that does not mean that institutions in Africa are not involved in clinical trials. You can see here, for instance, that we have clinical trials taking place in most countries in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. And this one that I have data for, the numbers in bracket actually refers to the number of trials that are being taking place. It's the 38 sub-Saharan countries that are where EDCTP, the European Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, is funding collaborative clinical studies. So while we have limited number of trials happening in Africa, within Africa itself, we still have a lot of institutions and a lot of clinical studies taking place. But why do we have this diversity? Why limited clinical trials taking place in Africa? I mean, there've been a lot of studies around this, and a systematic review happened, and it outlined some of the issues that we face, including lack of financial and human capacity, ethical and regulatory issues. I mean, there are delays in Africa because of low capacity in approving clinical trials. And then the research environment is weak, as well as our health systems, which we know about now. And there are other operational barriers and competing demands. Now, so if we go back to why am I focusing on this? Because so the Ebola outbreak took place 2014 to 2016. And then too soon after that, two important developments really happened in the country because of what we experienced there. Little involvement from government. There were mainly participation from the United States, England, and France managing what was happening there. But after that, in 2017, sorry, I'm having, sorry. After that, in 2017, we got the Africa CDC and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations launched. I don't think this is just a coincidence that we have this major issue of little African involvement, little coordination from the part of African institutions, And then the year after that was done, Africa CDC came online. And then the thing about CEPI was this other innovation that has now a $3.5 billion plan. So you can see a lot of money, a lot of organization. So I think at the regional level in Africa, it was recognized that some coordination involving African heads of states had to happen. And Africa CDC was launched to make that happen. And also a lot of money had to be invested in this. Now, my institution, the European Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, is collaborating with CEPI, Africa CDC, WHO, and the Bill and Gates Foundation to ensure that we improve involvement of African institutions in these conversations around clinical trials, product development, and that. And currently, the EDCTP, first of all, what it's got to do is ensure that these governments in Africa have got the capacity to monitor clinical trials. So we support, we fund governments to strengthen their ethics and regulatory capacities. And to date, we've spent over 15 million euros doing that. So all of these countries that you're seeing for the 6 African countries in Sub-Saharan Africa have been supported to strengthen their ethics and regulatory capacities. And in that 37 countries where ethics and regulatory projects are being conducted, and 28 of these where regulatory strengthening is happening. So again, I come back to this data just to show that, so we've supported countries to strengthen their ethics and regulatory capacity, and then that enabled this map where you have a lot of countries now doing many clinical trials. So even though Africa is contributing very little to that, but there are clinical trials going on, and there are this huge contribution from African scientists in that direction. Now, what was really helpful in all of this was the fact that the AVAREB, the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, this is an institution within the WHO, was able to connect regulators and ethics committees from member states in Africa to ensure that what happened in West Africa during the Ebola crisis does not happen again. And so remember, when there was this Ebola crisis in West Africa, none of these countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, that were mainly affected, had very strong regulatory capacity. So partners from the global north could come and do whatever they wanted and go back with the results. And in the end, most of the research deliverables, the papers that were published, were either led by institutions from the north or were carried out by institutions from the north. Now, if we see what has happened with COVID, come back now to 2020 and 2021, we had African institutions leading in the clinical trials that were taking place, and also in the outcomes of the clinical trials, and governments were taking ownership of what was happening, and regulatory authorities in Africa were very strong. And then we all know, for instance, the role of South Africa in that, and we know that the capacity in the continent has really developed a lot. So AVAREF, which is really within the WHO, has now become a one-stop end-to-end process for clinical trials, applications, review, and help improve the regulatory landscape in Africa. So just to summarize what I've said, so after the experience from West Africa, Africa CDC came, and other institutions realized the need to invest a lot of money into this area, as by CEPI, and then a strong African institution was able to support countries to ensure that they managed what was with the clinical trials that were taking place in the country and how they were conducted, and managed to stop this parachute research where researchers from the global North could come and do what they want and publish without involving African institutions. And I'm sure you'll ask me further questions, you'll ask me later to elaborate on these, and I'll be happy to do so. On that note, I thank you, and back to you again, Dr. Msomi.
Thank you, Moses, and thank all the panelists. Interestingly enough, Moses, you got to answer the first question. This question is from one of the people in the audience, Onunso. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And I suppose we are in this continent and we always have a gripe about resources. So the question from Chuku Onunso is, what is the EDCTP doing to overcome the barriers of conducting clinical trials in Africa? I was going to invite two other people to answer the question who are outside of this panel, but we'll see whether they're here. But the question is, what is the EDCTP doing to overcome the barriers of conducting trials in Africa? It's from Chuku Onunso. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what we're doing is, first of all, to enhance capacity in the institution. So sometimes funding agencies focus a lot on science, high-tech science, but for clinical trials to happen, we need to have strong regulatory and ethics capacities in this country. So for the last 10 years, EDCTP has been providing up to 3 million euros to support national ethics committees and strengthen capacities in that. And because of that, we have been able to support governments in about 36 countries. So that's one. So we support that. And then EDCTP, in collaboration with a lot of other funding agencies, again, supports the very clinical trials. And so, for instance, the malaria vaccine that has now been recommended by WHO, the clinical trials took place in Burkina Faso, the vaccine for children. The clinical trial site in Burkina Faso was supported by EDCTP. And there are other things, so EDCTP is also supporting networks in order to increase inclusion and ownership by African governments. So there are networks of excellence that are supported by EDCTP in the North, the West African one, Central Africa, Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa. So that much we are contributing to the to developing capacity for clinical trials in Africa. Over.
Thank you, Moses. The next question is directed, I suppose, at Kemi. And after Kemi, I would like to invite Yusuf Henriquez, who I see has joined the audience. The question is from Dr. Gundi. One of the important developments happening at local R&D institutions and in young biotech companies in the continent is new drug development. In many cases, these new drugs are designed to solve disease challenges in Africa. What clinical trial support is there to enable new drug development initiatives in the continent?
Thank you for that question. In fact, it's a very appropriate question, because one of the things we're talking about today is increasing clinical trial diversity. Well, that is one of the ways really that we can drive more clinical trial activities within the continent. But let me start from the beginning. When you're talking about drug discovery and drug development, typically in the past, the clinical trial effort comes in much later, meaning that you do your target identification, target validation, you do your preclinical work, and then you do your clinical work, and then you commercialize. Well, one of the things that we're doing right now is making sure that if we engage with healthcare institutions early, and you're doing early stage clinical trials, you can actually start to identify populations that would better respond to certain drug targets. And these really enhances clinical trials going forward. You're literally building products in a way that would allow you to find the right product for the right population by engaging with institutions, linking up with electronic medical records, using real world data, combining those with past clinical trial data or learning from past work to drive new hypotheses. But beyond that, some of the things that I talked about earlier in terms of how we can enable more precision clinical trials actually also apply to any type of clinical trials on the continent. Having, like Professor Moses said, having the right regulatory framework is very important. Many of our countries in Africa right now have been able to establish clear guidelines on how you run clinical trials and how you get the applications approved. We need more of that. And in fact, we need more of the harmonization that ABRF is driving, so that if I'm doing a trial in 5 countries in Africa, I do not have to follow 5 different regulations. So having harmonized regulatory framework is one way to also drive clinical trial support. Making sure that our healthcare professionals are trained on clinical trial methodologies. We know we take it for granted, but even simple things like getting GCP certifications, so that now when the investigators at the sites are now running these clinical trials, they know what to do following the required global standards. Already you're helping to drive clinical trial support. But I always say that infrastructure is important, right? If you take for granted the fact that you need to have electricity so that you can easily connect to your database and enter data and save it rapidly, or if you have samples that you're collecting, you can store them in the freezer and not worry about sample integrity because there's continuous energy to support that. When we start to invest in the infrastructure to drive those type of utilities that are taken for granted in other parts of the world, it would also help drive clinical trial activities in Africa. And one more thing really is that I want to mention is just collaboration, right? We have a lot to offer the rest of the world from Africa. We have a huge population, we have treatment naive, and to be fair, you know, there's lower cost of running trials in Africa than in other parts of the world, but we also have a lot to learn. And I would encourage that we all continue to collaborate with other developed countries and learning what they've done over the last 50 years to enhance their clinical trial methodologies, modify those learnings appropriately for our ecosystem and apply. Those are some of the ways, I know I could go on forever, but I will stop there. But those are some of the ways that we could drive our clinical trial support for new drug development in Africa.
Thank you, Kemi. I'd like to invite Yusuf, as somebody who's been very much involved in the development of infrastructure in the continent, genomics infrastructure. Maybe 2 minutes, Yusuf.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me join. I think all the points that was just brought up is an excellent transition. I think diversity is a key part of what's going to drive the future of precision medicine. As you know, my background, I worked at the FDA doing drug and device approvals. So this is something of deep passion to me. Infrastructure is number one. And then to the point, clinical trials and being able to educate and train the individuals on the continent is what's going to be required to drive the level of scientific studies, and then the findings that's going to be much needed in a population that I think is very understudied. I think, you know, again, what indigenous AI has done is, again, the collaboration. We understand that there's a huge opportunity for collaboration with all of the countries that are going to be struggling with, you know, bringing all of this together. But I think the unity amongst the continent is what's going to be able to put Africa at the forefront of driving precision medicine. And that's needed at the infrastructure level. So what we did is, you know, it's similar. We had to go create the infrastructure where we're now trying to set up these labs to do sequencing with well-established research institutions like Orem Institute to get, you know, individual samples, but also the training and education around these innovative technology like sequencing. To the last speaker's point, there's a lot of brilliant scientists on the continent. They just don't have access to the equipment and the innovative technology that is being utilized to bring precision medicine on, you know, more developed countries. are lacking on the continent. And so what you see is a grab and go and have to send out resources, which is samples leaving the continent, which I'm completely opposed of, because you're initially sending the IP and the opportunity and to build capacity on the continent. I think what we should be doing is coming together and getting some of the Ministry of Health and government to put the infrastructure in order to actually truly drive clinical trials and also drive the manufacturing and drug manufacturing and cell and gene therapy on the continent with the resources on the continent. So appreciate the opportunity to chime in. Love the presentation up to this point, and looking forward to collaborating with the other members on the call as well.
Thank you, Yusuf. The last question for today's panelists was originally directed at Professor Moses Bockarie, but it's a question that I feel, and I'm going to use my prerogative as a facilitator, that I feel is best repackaged towards Professor Miller, Veronica. And it talks to something that is really, really close to my heart, where a lot of the focus on clinical development, as far as Africa is concerned, is in infectious diseases. It ignores the fact that we have a pandemic or an epidemic in quite a few countries of metabolic syndrome or non-communicable diseases. And the question really is, what are the key trends in clinical trials as far as dealing with non-communicable diseases? Number one, but number two, what could be done in expanding this? Because it is something that, again, Africa has to lead in structuring the agenda for its own self, whatever non-communicable is there. It seems that the infectious diseases, as devastating as they are, they tend to be the flavor of the month in the global north, and as long as it serves certain interests. However, it doesn't go all the way. And we've spoken about infrastructure development today. Several speakers have spoken about that. And I'd like to tease you around the issue of non-communicable diseases, because they are a real challenge in the continent as well. Thank you. Over to you, Veronica.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is such an important area. And I will just make one small comment to take us back to infectious diseases, that infectious diseases can, also contribute to what we call non-communicable diseases through the process of inflammation. So definitely when it comes to things like diabetes and heart disease, et cetera, and the inflammatory process does play a huge role. And so, it is sort of a gateway to study that. But it is so important to really study these diseases as well for their own sake. And just common diseases like diabetes, like heart disease, kidney disease, those are huge. As well as one of the forums we have, we work at the forum, we work in different disease areas, and we bring together the regulatory agencies with the industry, with the communities and with the clinical researcher to really together figure out the best path forward. And one of our big projects is fatty liver disease. Now, fatty liver disease is so context dependent, and so many different factors, diet and lifestyle and all of these things contribute to that. But there is also a huge genetic background influence to fatty liver disease. And all of the studies are really being done US, Europe, Asia. I'm not aware of any studies, maybe Latin America. I'm not aware of any studies for fatty liver disease being done in Africa. And yet it leads to fibrosis, cirrhosis, end-stage liver disease. And right now, the only cure we have for that is a liver transplant. Now, that is a very complicated way to treat a disease, and very much sort of on a patient-by-patient level. but and requires huge infrastructure, obviously, to do. So I think for some diseases like that, we really need to, again, build up the networks on the continent and really engage the clinicians that are taking care of patients, and really drive that forward. But it needs to be, would be so ideal if we could have a platform where not just one company, but all the companies come together and say, how can we together, move this field forward? And and everything, Professor Moses Bockarie, everything you said, you spoke so much to my heart about increasing the regulatory capacity. That is so important to be able to do that. But absolutely, I think that is, we must not forget about non-communicable diseases.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you to all the panelists for today's session. I'm sure we could continue until midnight. These are very exciting conversations or dialogue, and I see that there's a flurry of questions. Unfortunately, we cannot tackle them now. As we promised in the beginning, this is the first of many dialogues, and it was not to test the water, because we've known for a very long time that this is an important area of dialogue that we should engage in as global partnership and as Africans in the continent and elsewhere, to see how we could move this dialogue and structure it in a manner that benefits the continent. So I think we want to end by thanking Amgen for stepping up to the plate when we called out to see, could we find a sponsor or an organization that will co-host this with us as BioAfrica. And I think taking Veronica's last comment and knowing that I'm probably messing up my own supper, invite other pharma companies to join hands with us. I'm particularly encouraged in seeing some of the emerging stars like 54 Gene, like Indigenous represented, and I've seen quite a few names in today's session that will define the future, probably a better future than where we currently are. So I'd like to end by thanking everybody and invite you to our next session, which will be communicated, and remind everybody that this is actually a launch series for BioAfrica 2022, which will be a hybrid event held in Durban, South Africa on the 27th to the 31st of August, physical as well as virtual. All of you who could make it there, Durban's a wonderful place, if I could say so myself. I'm currently in London, and I'm realizing how wonderful Durban is. London, this is the beginning of summer, but it's an interesting place. So I'm hoping to see you all in the next webinar, which hopefully will be co-hosted by BioAfrica and Amgen and Bio International in San Diego in about 3 weeks' time. Thanks everybody who participated today. Those who have asked questions, and we will continue to engage with those questions and pass them around to the panelists. Hopefully those questions will enable us to structure the agenda for the next webinar, because we really are hopeful that this is not just a talk shop, but it's a platform to co-create an agenda that could move our programs forward. Thank you.